Holding the breath. Exhale. Hi, welcome to Kundalini Yoga. My name is Nahal Atma and I'm here with Kavalya Amrita. We're going to be giving you a small set that you can do, Kundalini Yoga set, for prosperity. So the way that this works in our lives, you're basically stimulating meridians on the human body to be able to change the auric field. So you're going kind of behind the scenes and working at a very deep level and a very fundamental level with the human body and the human psyche with the mantras that we chant. We're working on all of these different aspects to be able to bring a heightened sense and a more prosperous version of ourselves out. So we're asking the creator, the creatrix, to change our energy field when we're doing this specific mudra and chant. It's called the Tantric Har. If you practice it every day for 40 days, you can just wait and see what will happen in your life. And the prosperity doesn't necessarily come through money or material objects. For me, it's been more of a internal sense of gratitude, and this internal sense of gratitude expands outward, so it seems like everything that I experience is prosperous and what I should be experiencing. So it's more of an internal feeling that is stimulated through these things, which is not a bad thing, because sometimes we have like more material things and that doesn't necessarily make us feel better or make us see ourselves as grateful. Is there anything that you wanted to share about your experience with the Har?
Oh yeah, it's been really fun.
Yeah.
And I definitely have had like money fall out of the sky on the same day, and I have had more money come into my life, but I've had such a abundance of opportunities, and not just the abundance of opportunities, but like a discernment on which ones to take in and which ones to let go, and this sense that everything I need is here, and I don't, and I've even, it's helped me, I feel like, raised my standards, so that I just know that saying no to this thing is saying yes to what I really want. And so there's a place where it's allowing me to not compromise so much of who I am, to be out of like a fear that I'm not, I got to take this thing because it's I'm not going to get another chance. I'm going to mess this up. So I feel like there's definitely been this whole discernment piece that's come with it. So that's a lot of prosperity to me. Like being really grateful for what I have. Being like, I feel like I've gotten more responsible in stewarding too. I'm like, oh, I better take care of my what I do have as well. So
thank you. So we'll just get into it. The mudra is hitting the pinkies together, the sides of the hands, kind of with a force. And then the index fingers come together, and it's very essential that the right thumb goes under the left, so you're kind of locking them. So we're working with the Jupiter, which is our index finger, and the moon energies, which is the side of our pinkies. So the eyes are 1/10 open, focused at the tip of the nose, kind of like you're cross-eyed, but you're not trying to be cross-eyed. You're just focusing there. And we're chanting HUD. And when we chant HUD, the tongue needs to come to the center upper palate. So we're pulling the navel and chanting HUD. 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 HUD.
HUD.
HUD.
HUD.
HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD.
HUD.
HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD. HUD.
had, 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 had,
had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had, had,
had.
Inhaling deep, holding the breath, consolidating the energy, and exhale, relaxing the hands down. Okay, so this short 11-minute exercise is, again, for prosperity and feeling yourself differently. You can practice it up to 40 days to feel the full benefit, and beyond 40 days to experience even more. So we're going to leave you with that, bringing the palms together, ending with 3 long satnams. Sat Nam.